I had mentioned the svara of the Meshech Chochmah, that the din of layeg l'rush, the idea that you don't mock a dead person because they can't do mitzvos, only applies to a mitzvah saseh, not a mitzvah lo saseh, because a mitzvah saseh adds kedusha, and when kedusha is added and a mace is not able to participate in that kedusha, the mace, the neshama, feels tsar. But vis-a-vis a negative commandment, there is no problem, because a violation of a negative depletes kedusha, and since the mace doesn't have the negative, so when you put shatnez on him, he doesn't lose anything, and therefore there's no loeg l'rush, and that's why the Meshech Chochmah says, the Gemara in Nida tells us that you're allowed to put shatnez on a mace if you hold that the mitzvos are batal. If the mitzvos will be chal again by tchias hamesim, then you cannot, because you're going to cause them to be over on shatnez. But if mitzvos betelis, you could. And the Meshech Chochmah says there's no problem of loeg l'rush. So I wanted to bring in a totally different, separate area where this svara reemerges in a different context. And this is a very long Gur Aryeh, right? The Gur Aryeh was the very first sefer that the Maharal published, and this is the Maharal's commentary on Rashi, right? The Maharal wrote a Perish on Rashi that's called Gur Aryeh, but as you might expect from the Maharal, he'll often digress, even in the Gur Aryeh, into other subjects in which he discusses it. And the Gur Aryeh discusses the very famous question that Chazal teach us. This is in Parshas Vayigash. Chazal teach us that the Avos kept the whole Torah before the Torah was given. That even before Hashem commanded the Torah, the Avos understood what the mitzvos were, and the Avos kept the whole Torah. Now, the truth of the matter is, the Gemara never says that beferish. The Mishnah in Kedushin says Avram Avinu kept the whole Torah before it was given. That is a Mishnah in Kedushin. All of the Achronim, almost a paraphrase, they assume this means the Avos and even the Shvatim kept the whole Torah before it was given. So one of the questions, there are many questions. In fact, the Mishnah Lamelech, one of the great commentaries on the Rambam, also has a book of drushos on the Chumash. And in those drushos, the Mishnah Melech goes through all of the different questions. Did the Avos keep the Torah? How much did they keep the Torah? And there are gazillions of questions, but we're just going to focus on one question. There are many, many more questions. And the one question is, how could Yaakov marry two sisters? Yaakov married Rachel and Leah. Rachel and Leah are sisters. Now, the problem is that it's true that the Isser of marrying two sisters, polygamy is permitted, but you can't marry two sisters, is only for Matan Torah. Bnei Noach are allowed to marry two sisters. So in terms of the Sheva mitzvahs Bnei Noach, there's not a problem. But if the Avos kept the Torah even before the Torah was given, then Yaakov would have kept the prohibition against marrying two sisters. How could he marry two sisters? Right? This is a famous, famous question. And the Maharal summarizes a few answers that are given. The first answer that is given is that of the Ramban on Chumash. And the Ramban says the idea that the Avos kept the whole Torah before it was given is only when they lived in Eretz Yisrael. When they lived in Eretz Yisrael, they felt they were in the palace of the king. And in the palace of the king, they have to follow the king's rules. When they were in Chutz La'aretz, it didn't bother them that much. And since Yaakov married Rachel and Leah when he was in Aram Naharaim, Padan Aram, in Chutz La'aretz, so it was mutter for him. And indeed, the Ramban points out, Rachel dies shortly after Yaakov comes to Eretz Yisrael, because at that point he's not supposed to marry two Achiyos. This is the Ramban's famous Yesod. Now, keep in mind the following. the Ramban is not referring to those mitzvahs that only apply to Eretz Yisrael. I mean, the Isser of 2 achiyos is not a mitzvah tuluya ba'aretz. It's not a mitzvah that depends on the land. After Matan Torah, the Isser of Shtei achiyos is everywhere in the world. But the voluntary observance of the avos, because it was voluntary, there was no commandment, only applies in Eretz Yisrael. This is Ramban's teretz. HaRav does not like Ramban's teretz. Although HaRav is an Achron, but he says he disagrees with Ramban on this because he says, hey, the Isser of Arayos is not connected to Eretz Yisrael, so why would there be more of an observance in Eretz Yisrael than in Chutz La'aretz? It's not a mitzvah tuluya ba'aretz, like Truma, like Meiser, so why should there be a difference? Now that's the Maharal. Maharal doesn't like the Ramban, but the truth is, the Ramban does explain himself. The Ramban says, since the Avos keeping the Torah was only a voluntary thing, it was not a mandatory thing, right? Chazal don't mean it was mandatory, so they felt that need for a voluntary observance only when they're in Eretz Yisrael. I mean, that's the Ramban's svara. So that is answer number 1. Answer number 2 that the Maharal brings, and he seems to bring it from somebody, but he doesn't say from whom. So it's interesting. I don't even know the primary source from which he gets this. This is not the Maharal's own answer. In fact, he'll argue with it. Is that even though it's true that Rachel and Leah are sisters, but when they renounce the paganism of Lavan, when they renounce the Avodah Zarah of Lavan, they became Gerim. They became the equivalent of converts. Now, obviously, the whole way conversion worked was not the same as today. There was no Beis Din or whatever, but they became Gerim. And by Gerim, we have a halacha, Ger sheniskayer kekatan shenayla dami. When a person converts to Judaism, they are considered to be a newly created entity. And this actually has very interesting halachic applications. That actually means that if a brother and sister convert to Judaism, under Torah law, midrabanan it's usher because of Marisayan. Under Torah law, if a brother and sister convert, they can marry each other because they're no longer considered to be related. Not only that, a mother and son and a father and daughter under Torah law, not rabbinically, are permitted to marry because all family relations are severed. They are newly created entities. So as a result, if it's true that a father and daughter are no longer related, and if it's true that a mother and son are no longer related, and if it's true that a brother and sister are no longer related, it would also be true that 2 sisters are no longer related. So therefore, since Yaakov married Rachel and Leah, when they assumed the religion of Yaakov, the belief in Hashem, so this would be the halacha of Ger sheniskayer kekatan shenayla dami. That's a very interesting answer. Now, again, I don't know if it's a complete answer because according to Chazal's Mesorah, the Avos even kept rabbinic laws. So the problem is that even after conversion, there would be an Isser D'Rabbanan. What do you do about that? Okay, but at least you've taken away the Isser D'Oraisa because Ger sheniskayer kekatan shenaylad dami. Now again, sometimes people who convert, they have emotional difficulty with this, meaning, according to the strict halacha, your father is no longer your father, your mother is no longer your mother. But you have to understand what that means. That doesn't mean you don't care about your parents. That doesn't mean you don't have love. It does not refer to the severing of an emotional connection. It means halachically, in terms of relation, you're not a blood relative anymore, but still, it's not worse than an adoption, right? If a parent adopts a child, the child has love and affection and akaras hatov, so all of those things are still here. And Ger sheniskayer kekatan shenayla dami is not suggesting you don't have any contact with your family. That's a separate shayla, what's good and what's not good. There may have to be some distance. You can't go for Christmas dinner or whatever it is, but you got to be a little bit of a cold-blooded lawyer, so to speak. In other words, this is a legal halachic concept. It is not an emotional concept in any way. But this is a teretz. Now, what? Yeah, there they. Yeah.
Someone marrying two sisters under Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach is no
That's
problem.
totally mutter. Totally mutter. Yeah.
My question is: are there overlapping jurisdictions? Like, for example, Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach still apply to Jews as well?
Yeah. So that's yeah.
Does that mean that even though, according to Torah law, the person's a ger, and under the Torah of Moshe, these people are not sisters anymore, but under Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, they still are sisters, and therefore.
But that's permitted. In other words, mimanav shach it'll be permitted. Meaning, under the Noachite code, it's permitted, and under Jewish law, we have a conversion, so they're not related.
So my question is only in those certain issues, like a mother or a father or something marrying their kid. That would still be a surah according to Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, wouldn't it?
Okay, so that's a good question. This is actually the topic of the Mishnah Lamelech's essay, and that is, were the Jewish people before Matan Torah subject to the Noachite laws, or did they become such a distinct nation that the Noachite code itself no longer governed them, and they were governed only by halacha? That's exactly the issue that the Mishnah Lamelech discusses in two very, very famous essays. Well, how do I know? Again, it's, there is a Ramban, an interesting Ramban, that seems to say that Avraham Avinu left the category of Noachites and became a new religion. That's the meaning of he's the first Jew, that Judaism started with Avraham. Now, obviously, there's many overlaps. I mean, you can't murder under Jewish law as well, but nevertheless, the notion is that the Noachite law no longer covers.
It's a machloket.
It is a big
machloket.
machloket.
Some say they're both in effect.
That's correct. Some say they're both in effect, and others say that the halacha superseded the Noachite code as it applies to Jews. So there's a lot of discussion on this. Now, yeah.
The part where because they rejected idol worship, that they're gearing.
Yeah.
The process of geirus changed because that's not enough for us to believe them, or because it just changed with Matan Torah and everything?
Well, it did change with Matan Torah because once we have 613 mitzvos, so the process of conversion requires that the convert accept 613 mitzvos. And it also requires a base. And there were many, many details that were nischadesh at Matan Torah.
Yeah. Like tefillah
and mikveh, that's right. Well, that's hard to know. I mean, tefillah is a requirement, but maybe Rachel and Leah went to the mikveh. We really don't know what conversion they did, but maybe they did go to the mikveh. That wouldn't be impossible, obviously. They went to a river or a lake or something. Now, after saying this Yesod of Gershon Iskayr, the Maharal then segues to a peripheral question, which is very fascinating. And that is, it's mamish connected to last week's Parsha and this week's Parsha. And that is, Chazal actually say that all of the Jewish people underwent a conversion at Matan Torah. They underwent a conversion. In fact, the very laws of conversion as we practice them today are derived from what the Jews did before or at Matan Torah. What are the three requirements of Gerus for a Jewish man, or for a non-Jewish man who wants to be Jewish? The three requirements are, number one, bris milah, circumcision for the purpose of conversion. We're not talking about the baby circumcision. Number two, immersion in a mikvah. And number three, the declaration with sincerity that you accept upon yourself the obligations of the mitzvos, both the written Torah and the oral Torah. That's called Kabbalah's mitzvos. Now, let's look at what the Jews did before Matan Torah. They all did bris milah when they left Mitzrayim. So that was bris milah. Number two, they went to the mikveh. It mentions they should immerse themselves and even immerse their clothing. And number three, when they declared everything Hashem says, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do and we will learn, that's acceptance of the mitzvahs. So the Gemara says, Matan Torah was a conversion of the Jewish people. By the way, that seems to contradict the idea that they became a different religion from Avram's time. That actually implies, that whole concept implies, there were Noachites until Matan Torah. I mean, that's, right, so one has to reconcile that. So the Maharal raises the question as the following. If you're going to tell me that a ger that converts is a newly created entity who is not related to other people who convert with him, then it should stand to reason that the generation of Jews that converted at Matan Torah would not have incestuous restrictions. Brother could marry sister, father could marry daughter, at least Oraisa. Son could marry mother. In other words, he says, we find in the Torah all of these prohibitions of Gilui Arayos based on relations, and yet, if Matan Torah is Gerus, it shouldn't apply to the first generation. It should only apply to the later generations that are born in the desert. Now, the emes is, the Meshech Chochma actually says, Einochinami. The Meshech Chochma actually says, because Matan Torah is Gerus, the first generation could marry anybody they wanted. There were no restrictions. Well, they couldn't marry a married woman, that they couldn't do, but there was no restrictions on brother or sister. There were no incestuous restrictions because of Gershon Iskayar. But the Maharal finds that to be improbable. The Maharal says the Torah is mashma that these are prohibitions that are in effect right away. So because of this, the Meshech Chochma says the Maharal. Maharal says a tremendously interesting chiddush. The Maharal says, although it's true that Gershon Iskayar Kakatan Shanayla Dami, that conversion is a newly created person, that doesn't apply to the conversion of Matan Torah. The conversion of Matan Torah, even though it's a conversion, did not make us a newly created entity. And therefore, the heter of a brother to sister, and daughter to father, and son to mother, did not apply to the Gerus of Matan Torah, because the Gerus of Matan Torah, there is no rule of Gershon Iskayar Kekatan Shenayla Dami. Why is that? Because he says like this. He says that in order to, the rule that Gershon Iskayar erases prior relations is only when the conversion is consensual, which of course all conversions are. You agreed to become a Jew, so that wipes out all prior connection. But the Gerus of Matan Torah was very unique. According to some views of Chazal, the Gerus of Matan Torah was compulsory and not voluntary. Remember the teaching? Hashem held the mountain over our head. And Hashem said, if you are makabel the Torah, it's good. If you're not makabel the Torah, I'm going to flatten you, and this will be your grave. Now, the pashtus of the Gemara, again, I'll explain the Maharal a bit deeper, but the pashtus of the Gemara and the Maharal is that the Gerus of Matan Torah was a compulsory Gerus, not a volitional Gerus. So Maharal is mechadesh that Gershon Iskayar Kekatan Shenayla Dami only applies to consensual Gerus. It does not apply to compulsory Gerus. Now the truth is, this is, as mathematicians would say, a set of one, because there is no such thing as compulsory Gerus except for that one. But that one is a compulsory Gerus, and therefore you don't say Ger Shen Iskayar. So going back to Rachel and Leah, this was a digression. Rachel and Leah, Yaakov could marry two sisters because they converted, and there's the halacha of Ger Shen Iskayar Katan Shenayla Dami. Maharal has a segue. So how come there were incest restrictions for the generation of Matan Torah? That's also a conversion. So we should say Gershon Iskayar Katan Shenayla Dami. And the answer is because that was a compulsory conversion and not a volitional conversion. This is the chiddush of the Maharal. Now, just to focus on this for a moment, Tosfos asks, a very strong question. How could the Gemara in Shabbos describe the conversion of Matan Torah as compulsory? The Jewish people are praised because they declared everything Hashem said, Naseh v'nishma. Meaning they said, we are giving God a blank check. Naseh. We are committing ourselves to action, even before we know what Hashem is saying. So what was it? So Tosfos gives an answer that Ein Achinami, we certainly accepted the Torah voluntarily, but because of the thunder and the lightning, we were so frightened we were going to change our mind. So the mountain over our heads is just warning us, actually making us more frightened. Better not change your mind. So that's a good answer, but that undermines Maharal's point. Maharal says, since it was a compulsory gerus, it doesn't erase family relations. According to Tosfos, it wasn't a compulsory gerus. The gerus was volitional, but we were scared we would have changed our mind. We would have said, I want to get out of this deal. So the compulsion was simply to say, better not change your mind, which anyway, halachically, once you convert, you can't change your mind, right? So I'm just giving you a little ha'ara that the way Tosfos answers the kasha from Naseh v'nishma, this would not fit the Maharal's distinction between the gerus of Matan Torah. Now, there's another answer that is given, and it's a pella that Tosfos doesn't bring this answer because this is a medrash tanchuma. This is a medrash. Chazal give the answer. Chazal actually asked the question in the medrash tanchuma, how can you say they were forced into Matan Torah? Isn't that Naseh v'nishma? So the medrash tanchuma says the following: they willingly accepted the Torah shebichsav, the written Torah, that which will be written down, they accept willingly, but they were not willing to accept all of the Torah Shebal Peh. They had to be forced into that, and therefore Naseh v'nishma, the Medrash Tanchuma says, is going on Torah Shebichsav, and the Kafa Aleim Har Kegiges, holding the mountain over their head, is going on Torah Shebal Peh. Now, why would they be more willing to accept Torah Shebichsav over Torah Shebal Peh? So there are two reasons. Number one, Torah Shebichsav without Torah Shebal Peh is infinitely malleable. So the Torah Shebichsav says, thou shalt not do work on Shabbos. Okay, that's great. I won't go to the office. I'll go to the beach. I'll go to the mall. I'll go to the movies. Comes the Torah Shebal Peh and says, can't do this, can't do this, can't do this. So I don't want to have that here. I'll go with the Torah Shebichsav and have my basic bare bones Judaism, and it's not going to make a big imposition on me. That's one reason. The other reason is the difficulty of learning. The Torah Shebal Peh is a difficult analytical process, and they were not willing to accept the work and the mental exertion that it would require. So according to this, Matan Torah, according to the Medrash Tanchuma, Matan Torah was a composite of volitional conversion and compulsory conversion, a volitional conversion on the Torah Shebichsav, and a compulsory conversion on the Torah Shebal Peh. Right? So we have, again, so the question is, how do you reconcile holding the mountain over their heads with Naseh v'nishma? So answer one is they accepted everything baratzon, but they were going to back out, so the mountain was simply to hold them in place. Number two, they accepted baratzon, the Torah Shebichsav, but they were not willing to accept the Torah Shebal Peh. Yeah.
I thought that the Torah Shebichsav came much later. So, so how is it possible to do this when you only had Torah Shebal Peh?
Yeah, that's correct. But the understanding has to be that even though these specifics were not there later, but they understood that the ultimate structure to which they are committing would comprise these things. In other words, these are the terms of the deal.
And also, could the same argument be made on a partial level, just saying, oh, well, so the conversion to Torah, the pay is, oh, that wasn't real, so we're all Karaites now or something like that. How would that...
Well, the Gemara, well, number one, well, God did force us. Now, the Gemara in Megillah actually says that until Purim, we were keeping this under coercion. On Purim, we accepted out of love that which we had accepted out of fear. So that actually means Purim is very much connected to Torah Shabbat Peh, precisely because we accepted, right? So what's coming up in a few weeks, in fact, is the holiday of the acceptance of Torah Shabbat Peh of love. But there's a third answer that the Maharal himself gives. It's a beautiful answer. He says, and I think this will explain his chiluk in Gershon Iskayer. He says like this. He says, it's a davar pashut. The Jewish people accepted the Torah willingly. If they would have accepted it by coercion, it wouldn't have been worth very much. And that's Nasa B'Nishma. They accepted everything willingly. But after they accepted Torah willingly, God shows them, wow, it's really lucky you made that decision, because if you didn't make that decision, the world would cease to exist. You see the point here? It's not that before, when he asks them, do you want to accept the Torah? If he would have told them, you know, if you don't accept the Torah, the world ceases to exist, we would have accepted it out of fear. That wouldn't have counted. We accept the Torah with love, but then Hashem shows us after the fact how momentous our decision is. That our decision decided the very survivability of the world, because the world was created so that the Jewish people would accept the Torah. So now it's a very beautiful idea. In other words, Hashem didn't want to tell us the consequences of our non-acceptance ahead of time, because then it would have been coercion. But afterwards, Hashem shows us how momentous that decision is. Now, that, by the way, does contradict the Gemara in Shabbos that indicates until Purim we accept it under coercion. According to the Maharal, there's no coercion here at all. But I want to go back to the earlier Maharal, and that is, the Maharal says, on the conversion of Matan Torah, you don't say Gershon Iskayer. Right? That's why Yaakov, that's why the first generation could marry brother and sister. I would suggest the Maharal actually means that the notion that conversion severs your relationship is only because it's a decision you didn't have to make, right? A ger doesn't have to become Jewish, and you make that decision, you're severing your original identity. But with the Jewish people, accepting the Torah is something we were born to do. We were born to accept God's Torah. That's what it means, we have to do it. And therefore, accepting the Torah for Klal Yisrael was not a repudiation of their essential identity. It was an affirmation of their essential identity. And that's why it doesn't sever the relationship. I'm affirming who I am. I'm not rejecting who I am. Right? So that's what the Maharal means, a conversion through compulsion, meaning compulsion not in the sense that God put a gun to my head, because according to the Maharal, God didn't put a gun to my head till afterwards. But compulsion in the sense that this is who I am. So I'm not cutting it off anything. I'm expressing the mitzias that is within me. Okay. But all of this is actually very important, but this is a digression to the main question that the Maharal is discussing in Parshas Vayigash, and that is, remember the question, don't lose sight of the question, if the Avos kept the whole Torah, before it was given on a voluntary basis, how could Yaakov marry two sisters, which although it is permitted under the Noahide law, it is forbidden under the Torah law? So Ramban's answer, Chutz La'aretz versus Eretz Yisrael. Second answer, Maral brings, Rachel and Leah converted, and therefore Gershon Iskayer, Kekatan Shenola Dami, the sisters are not related. But then the Maral himself gives a third answer, and this is why I'm bringing this in, because it actually segues into the Meshech Chachma about Loeg L'Rush. And the Maral says an interesting chiddush. He says, the statement that the Avos kept the whole Torah before it was given only refers to the positive commandments. It does not refer to the negative commandments. So Avram Avinu wore tefillin, and he wore tzitzis, and he said Shema, and he kept all of the positive commandments of the Torah. But vis-a-vis the negatives, sometimes they kept them and sometimes they didn't. They didn't feel a problem. Now, the explanation is exactly like the Meshech Chachma. Mitzvos say add holiness. So even though the Avos were not commanded, they saw that this adds Kedusha to themselves and to the world, so they did these mitzvahs. Violation of a negative is a depletion, it's a demerit. But it's a demerit only if you're transgressing the will of God. If you're not transgressing the will of God, there is nothing wrong in violating a negative commandment. So the Avos did not lose anything by violating negatives. In other words, whatever their Kedusha was, it was not depleted, just like the dead body. And therefore, Maral actually says that the Avos were willing to violate negative commandments. It mamish stims. It's very, very consistent with the logic of the Meshech Chachma. And in fact, I'll bring you a halachic raya to this idea. Let me give you the halachic raya to this. That a mitzvah saseh has value even if you're not commanded, because it adds Kedusha. And the example would be for women. Women are exempt from many, not all, mitzvos saseh shazman grama, right? Mitzvos that are time bound. Now, that includes lulav, esrog, shofar, sukkah, tzitzis, which we don't wear at night, and tefillin, that we don't wear at night or Shabbos. Now, if a woman wants to do these mitzvahs, tefillin might be an exception. Maybe I'll talk about it another time, but certainly if a woman wants to sit in a sukkah, lulav, shofar, not only is she permitted to do the mitzvah, but she even gets reward for doing the mitzvah. It's a lower level of reward because those who are commanded get more reward than those who are not commanded. But a woman certainly gets reward for doing a mitzvah that she's exempt from. And the reason is because every mitzvah, even if you're not commanded, brings holiness into the world, and you're doing a good thing. Now, so there is a concept in halacha called Eina Mitzvah V'Yaisa. The interesting question is, could you extend this to a guy? Let's say a guy wants to put on tzitzis or wear tefillin. Some poskim actually say a guy can also be an Eina Mitzvah V'Yaisa. Even a non-Jew, the Mishnah Berurah is mashma, a non-Jew could put on tefillin in order to get reward of an Eina Mitzvah V'Yaisa. Okay. Now, let's take a negative commandment. Let's imagine the following scenario. A Kohen is not allowed to marry a divorced woman. That's a negative commandment. Now, let's say you're a Yisrael, maybe it's a bad example, and a shidduch is proposed to you with a divorced woman. Now, there may be reasons why that's not a good shidduch, that's a shidduch problem. But let's imagine you have the following svara. There is a negative commandment in the Torah not to marry a divorced woman. Now, it's true that only applies to a Kohen. So I'm not a mitzvah, but since even doing a mitzvah if you're not mitzvah, you get reward, I want to fulfill the mitzvah of not marrying a divorced woman, so I will get reward for fulfilling a negative commandment that only applies to a Kohen. Right? Now everybody's laughing, right? That sounds so crazy. Well, let me ask you, if a woman could say, I'm not commanded to take a lulav, but I want to do a mitzvah I'm not commanded to do, because I will still get reward as an eino mitzvah v'yaisa, right? And that's 100% valid logic. And indeed, Ashkenazim even say a woman makes a bracha. Sfardim don't make a bracha. They don't say, okay, Ashkenazim make a bracha, but everybody says, eino mitzvah v'yaisa. So why can't I make the same argument? I'm not going to marry a divorced woman because I want to be makayim the mitzvah of a Kohen not marrying a gerusha. Or, another example, I don't go to funerals because even though I'm a Yisrael, maybe that's a more realistic example, but I don't become tamei lameis because I want to get reward of fulfilling the negative commandment. Right? The answer is that eino mitzvah v'yaisa only works on mitzvah saseh. There is no such concept as taking on a negative commandment as an eino mitzvah, because mimanavshach, you're not going to gain kedusha, and if you don't keep the negative, you're not going to lose kedusha because you're not violating God's commandment. And that's why the Maharal says the Avos did not keep negative commandments, because they weren't mitzvah. If they weren't mitzvah, nothing's going to happen to them. They're not going to lose anything. Now the Maharal does ask a kasha that you see there is a pagam, because the Gemara in Arvei Pesachim discusses when Mashiach comes and there's going to be a big seuda, right? So who's going to be honored with benching? Who's going to get the honor of Birkas Hamazon? So it mentions that they go through a lot of different people when they reach Yaakov Avinu. And they say, Yaakov, lead the benching. Yaakov says, I can't lead benching because I married 2 sisters. So it's considered to be a little bit, by the way, David HaMelech winds up leading the benching. That's Kos Yeshua Sesa. I lift up the cup of salvation in Hallel, and in the name of God I call. It's a remez to Lasid Lavai, David HaMelech himself. So actually Mashiach will be his descendants, but David will be the Zaidi, like honoring your grandfather, and he will be the one who leads Birkas Hamazon. Okay, so the Maharal says, what's the problem? There's no problem with Yaakov marrying 2 sisters. Okay, so the Maharal talks about that. But I just wanted, the only reason I went into this long arichas, number one, it's a very, very interesting Gur Aryeh, and number 2, it ties in exactly with the Meshech Chochmah's Svara that there's no loeg la rush on negative commandments. Okay, and he says loeg la rush, and the Maharal speaks about eino mitzvah v'yaisa, that the Avos did not keep loisases on a level of eino mitzvah v'yaisa, because on a loisaseh you don't say this inyan of eino mitzvah v'yaisa. Okay, stop here.